What happens when you are frightened or anxious or in a state of real arousal? How clear do you think your thoughts are? Do you really think that you're processing things and reasoning with the kind of sharpness and clarity that you would were you not in such a state? Chances are, even if we think that we are dealing with things well and able to think clearly, when we are keyed up, when we are distressed, when we are afraid, we're probably not thinking as clearly as perhaps we may believe. So let's spend a little bit more time talking about this today on Gospel Minded. Hello, I'm Dr. Garrett Boyer. Welcome to Gospel Minded, an outreach of Benedictus Psychological Services. Check out that website, benedictuspsych.com. Now, each week here on Gospel Minded, we talk about psychology, emotions, mental health, and well-being, and we reflect on how these important topics are related to the Sunday Gospel reading each week. I always point out this isn't a substitute for actually getting yourself to church or participating in counseling, therapy, spiritual direction, if you are involved with those sort of things. But like we know so well, and like we've seen time and time again, things of our mind and our psychology so often go together beautifully with our spirituality. So, if this is your first time seeing this channel, welcome. If you are returning, welcome back. Either way, I hope that you will like this video and then do me the favor of clicking subscribe so that you never miss an episode of Gospel Minded. Well, friends, here we are today reading from Matthew 14, which tells one of those very familiar stories from the Gospels. Jesus has sent his disciples ahead of him across the Sea to Galilee, and as they're crossing, the storm comes up. The wind is against them, the waves are beating against the boat, and then sometime during the night, the disciples see something or someone walking across the water towards them. And understandably, there's some fear. Perhaps they're terrified. Matthew tells us that they cry out saying, "It is a ghost." But Jesus immediately responds and says, "Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid." And then we hear Peter say something remarkable. "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And then what does Jesus say? He says, "Come." And so what happens then? Peter gets out of the boat and he actually himself begins to walk on the water towards Jesus. Well, what happens next? Of course, Peter begins to notice the wind and the elements, and suddenly, understandably, he becomes afraid. And in that moment, he begins to sink. And Peter yells out, "Lord, save me." And what does Jesus do? But immediately reaches out his hand and catches Peter. Now, in this story, of course, there are a lot of different theological insights that we can draw from this. But I think there's a lot of important psychological insight as well, that's particularly relevant to our lives. Because I think, in a very real sense, most of us maybe know that experience of being afraid, fear. Maybe we have a sense of what it would be like to be out in a boat in the midst of a storm. Yeah, because we do understand fear, being frightened. Now, here's the thing. Fear can really distort our perceptions. So think about these disciples' first reaction. They see Jesus walking toward them on the water, but they don't recognize him. Instead, they believe that they are seeing a ghost. Well, psychologically, I think there's something kind of fascinating about that. The disciples aren't simply observing something unusual. They're interpreting what they are seeing through a lens of fear, really. And that's something that all of us who are human beings tend to do when we are frightened, when we are anxious, when we are keyed up. Our brains don't process information exactly the same way that our brain would if we were calm. Because when we are calm, we're generally better able to tolerate ambiguity and to deal with that kind of thing. And we can say, I'm not sure what's happening. Let's figure it out. But when we are afraid, uncertainty itself can begin to feel threatening. And what happens then? This familiar thing that we start to fill in the blanks. What was that? What does this mean? What if something is wrong? What if I'm not safe? And the mind can quickly move towards the most threatening interpretation. That's part of what anxiety does. So, it takes something uncertain and asks, what's the worst possible explanation here? And sometimes that interpretation may be more accurate, but so often that isn't the accurate interpretation. So the important point here is that fear influences our perception. Fear doesn't necessarily create the danger, but it definitely can change how we interpret things that are dangerous. And then this brings us to a second psychological point. It's that in the gospel, Jesus addresses the fear before he addresses the situation. Remember what Jesus said to the disciples. He doesn't immediately start to explain, the storm. Yes, he doesn't give them a lecture about weather patterns or the physics behind meteorology. He doesn't say anything either like, calm down, guys, it's just bad weather. There's nothing to worry about. No, instead, he says, take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. So, in other words, Jesus first addresses their emotional state. And psychologically, that's a powerful thing. When people get overwhelmed, they often are not in the best position to process complicated information, maybe any kind of information. When our nervous system is highly activated, our ability to think clearly and to consider alternatives and evaluate situations objectively, it can become much more difficult. So this is why in counseling, like as a therapist, sometimes the first task isn't solving the problem or addressing the problem. Sometimes the very first task is helping a person become regulated enough to just think about the problem. And there's an important difference here. Jesus doesn't tell them anything like the storm isn't real, or he doesn't pretend that nothing frightening is happening, because indeed it is. The storm is frightening. But Jesus simply tells them, you don't have to face this fear alone. There's something profoundly important about that. Take courage. It is I. Sometimes what we need most in a frightening moment isn't necessarily an immediate solution that comes at the snap of a finger. Perhaps what's needed most is that reassurance that I'm not dealing with this alone, or I don't have to go into this all by myself. And then that leads to Peter's response, courage. So courage doesn't mean the absence of fear. Peter hears Jesus say, do not be afraid. And then Peter's response is, Lord, if you command me to come to you on the water, then I will. And Peter doesn't ask Jesus to make the storm disappear, but instead he asks Jesus to call him out into the middle of the storm. And Jesus says, come. So Peter gets out of the boat, and just take a second to put yourself in Peter's shoes and think about how remarkable that is. They're afraid. They see Jesus coming on the water. Peter is probably afraid. The disciples, I'm sure, are still afraid. The storm is still going on. The water is still splashing and raging. The wind is still blowing. Um, Nothing about those external circumstances suddenly becomes comfortable. And yet, Jesus says, "Come," and Peter moves. And this gives us an important thing to consider when we think about courage. Again, it's not the absence of being afraid. In fact, if you aren't afraid of something, you don't necessarily need courage to do it. Courage becomes meaningful, I think, precisely in those times when we are afraid, when fear is present, when we are anxious or keyed up. We sometimes imagine that we need to get rid of our fear before we can act. People will tell themselves things like, once I'm less anxious, then I'll do it. Or once I feel more confident, then I'll take that next step. Or once I know with clarity what's going to happen, then I'll move forward. But that's not how things work so often. I think more times than not, the confidence gets built after we take action rather than before. And sometimes we make this discovery that we can tolerate something only by actually entering into it. For example, just thinking out loud here, imagine somebody who's afraid of public speaking. Now, they might say to themselves, I'll give the presentation when I'm not nervous about it anymore. But that nervousness may never completely disappear. I think for such a person, courage instead may come from them saying, I'm nervous and I'm going to do it anyway. Or think about somebody who has a difficult conversation coming up. Perhaps they're afraid of being rejected. Perhaps they're afraid of the conflict. Perhaps they're afraid of misunderstanding. And so again, courage isn't necessarily saying, I'm not scared. I'm not scared of any of that kind of stuff. But instead, courage is saying, I'm scared that this conversation is going to have challenge, but the conversation is important enough for me to have it anyway. And this is what we see Peter doing. He doesn't wait until the storm becomes calm. Instead, he jumps right out while the storm is raging on. And I think that's an important psychological insight, that what we focus on can determine what becomes psychologically, shall we say, dominant. Peter gets out of the boat. He walks toward Jesus. And then Matthew brings up that point when he says that Peter saw how the winds were getting strong, and then he was getting frightened. And I think that's interesting. Why? Because, again, the wind didn't suddenly appear. The storm wasn't new. When Jesus got out of the boat, the wind was already there. The storm was already raging on. Nevertheless, Peter got out of the boat. So what changed was Peter's attention. At first, Peter's attention is directed towards Jesus. He's looking at where he's going. He's moving towards Jesus, who had beckoned him, come. But then what happens? His attention shifts. He notices the wind. He notices the waves. His attention now is split, and he notices the danger. And suddenly the storm, for him, I think, becomes larger than anything else. And I think this is something that many of us can understand and relate to. Like I mentioned at the beginning, what happens when we become anxious or fearful? Boy, our attention really narrows, and we start focusing on the problem, whatever it may be. And there can be any number of things. A financial problem, maybe something bad is happening at work, or there's some kind of work situation. Maybe some conflict in a relationship. Maybe it's a health concern. Maybe it's something that happened some years ago that hasn't fully been addressed or taken care of. Or maybe it's something that hasn't happened at all yet. We're worried about something that's going to be coming up in the future. Whatever it is, when our mind starts to circle around it, what happens? We can start asking that what if question. What if? Well, what if? What if? And the more that we focus on the threat, the larger the threat can become psychologically. And again, this doesn't mean that the problem isn't real. I mean, in the gospel, the wind was really blowing, the waves really were crashing. Peter's fear wasn't completely irrational at all. But something happened when the storm became the primary object of his attention. He lost sight of where he was going. And I think that's an important lesson to chew on here. What captures my attention? What occupies my own thoughts when I wake up in the morning? What are the things that direct our mind? You think about when you're driving, where are your thoughts at? Or what do you replay in your mind when you lay down at night? What is the thing that has become, psychologically speaking, larger than everything else? Because what captures our attention can really start to shape our emotional experience. If I'm constantly focusing on everything that could go wrong, I will probably experience the world as increasingly threatening. Or if I am constantly focusing on my failures, I might begin to experience myself as a failure. Or if I'm consistently thinking that everything I can't control is going on around me, well, then I probably will feel powerless. I think about Peter, like that focus on the storm. For us, our own storms, if we're focused on that, are we going to lose track of where we are actually trying to go? So Peter's problem wasn't that the storm wasn't real. The problem was that the storm became more important than who he was walking toward. And perhaps that's where this gospel reading today speaks most directly to me anyway. We all have storms, whatever they are. Some of them can be external, some of them may be internal. Plenty of times there are circumstances that we can't control, and sometimes there are things that have been going on for years. The Christian life doesn't make any promises that there won't be storms. In fact, think about this story. Jesus begins with the disciples here already in the middle of this storm. But what Jesus offers is not a life without storms, but his presence, even in the midst of them. Take courage. It is I. And that gives a powerful way to think about courage. So maybe courage is not saying, I don't have anything to be afraid of. Maybe instead, courage is saying, I am afraid, but that fear doesn't have to determine where I look or where I go. Peter steps out of the boat while the wind is blowing. Yep, he becomes frightened. He loses focus, and then he begins to sink. But the story doesn't stop there with that. He reaches out. He calls, Jesus, save me. And Jesus reaches back. Something worth thinking about. So, like I say every week, this is as much for me as it is for anybody else. But I guess the question worth chewing on and pondering is this. What storm has captured your attention? And even in the middle of that storm, What are you looking towards? Because sometimes the difference between being overwhelmed by the storm and continuing through it isn't whether the storm is real. Sometimes it is, where have we placed our attention? And maybe this is the invitation of Matthew 14. Simply this: don't wait for the storm to disappear before you learn to walk in it, but keep your eyes on where you are going. And then when the fear comes, remember that courage doesn't mean you're not afraid, right? It means that fear doesn't have to have the final word. And I think that's a good thing worth thinking about. I hope you found this helpful and useful, and I hope that I'll see you next time. Between now and then, let's keep each other in prayer. I'm Dr. Garrett Boyer, and this is Gospel Minded. Take care.